Hello, and welcome to episode 125 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Killorn in incredibly rainy Northern California.
And I'm John Denning in slightly rainy Los Angeles.
John, you're not having an atmospheric river like I am?
No.
Or are you?
This is more of a drizzle. People here are still in a full-on panic about it, but yours is worse.
It is quite bad here. It's about to get really bad, so we're hoping we can get through this podcast without being flooded out. But let's not worry about that. Let's worry about what we're going to talk about today, which is the recap of 2022, as well as a kind of preview of 2023, all in the LSAT world. So this is the state of our LSAT union as it stands today.
Yeah, these are fun. They've become something of a tradition. I don't know if this is the third one we've done or just the second, but it's kind of nice to pause for a minute and take a look back and to look forward.
That's exactly right. And unlike the government, we can select a speaker here. So I'm going to start by speaking and say, John, what are you drinking tonight?
How topical. I wonder if you actually know what I'm drinking or if this is about to surprise you. Your wife sent me a few bottles of your wine for Christmas. With your blessing or without, I don't know. But I'm drinking a bottle of Fence Post Cabernet, which is delicious, and tell her I said thanks.
The Cab. I just had a bottle of it the other night with friends.
Yeah, I recommend it all the time. If you're listening to this and don't know what I'm talking about, Dave has a wine label called Fence Post. Their Cabernet is sensational.
I like the Syrah better, but don't tell anybody.
Oh, no, that just plugs two wines instead of one. It's even better.
Whoops.
What about you?
I am also drinking wine, but I am drinking something from Portugal. This is a Wars port from 2017, and you obviously know a lot about port these days after having visited Portugal in the last 12 months or so.
Yeah, I was just over there not too long ago, and I think this is one of the ports you recommended. It was a little bit anti-port, and I changed my mind. I've fallen in love. I thought they were just sickly sweet, syrupy, but some are very pleasant.
Some are really good. Wars is like the oldest British port house, and I love vintage port. It's fantastic. Cool thing about vintage port is they don't make it every year. That's why they call it vintage. They only make it in certain years when they feel the quality is high enough.
Conditions are right, kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of the way we do podcasts. When we're ready, we let the podcast out to the world.
When we're in the mood. Well, speaking of a mood, let's talk about the song.
It's all you, John.
Yeah. What we usually do with these, and we did it last year too, and I think it was Bruno Mars, is we just try to figure out what the top song of the year is by plays or listens or Spotify. And
The Weeknd.
Was it The Weeknd?
Yeah.
All right. Maybe Bruno had it the year before. But this year, it's Harry Styles, and the song is As It Was, which is particularly a fitting title, given what we're doing here.
I'd have to agree. I'm sure that even if it wasn't the top song, but it was just close, we would have chosen it anyway because it's just so apropos.
Yeah. And I love Harry Styles, so.
I know you're a big fan.
I'm a big fan.
He's all right with me. I think he's a cool dude.
He seems pretty cool. So there you go. We got drinks. We got tunes. Let's do this before we get into the actual LSAT part of this. I know you and I've been kind of doing just a rundown on numbers as the year is wrapped up. And some of the numbers that we've gotten back have been specific to the podcast. So let's talk a little bit about just the podcast itself, how it and we fared over the past 12 months. And a couple of maybe our favorite episodes too. This is always neat to look back and think of things that are highlights in our catalog, as it were.
All right. I'm up for that.
All right. So January of last year started with episode 101. So we're about 25 episodes in here. I can tell you one of my favorite episodes that we did about midway through the year was getting started with the LSAT. I've had a lot of people respond to this. I think we called it a roadmap for success. People at the very beginning of the journey, just starting to study or even trying to figure out how to study, who listened to that and have written me messages and been like, dude, that gave me so much clarity and purpose going forward. So that episode 114 is when that was. I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, if you're new to the podcast, that's a great way to kind of, and really to the LSAT itself, a great way to get started and to have a few things to think about going forward. One of my favorite ones, which I think we really collaborated on, was episode 119, which was about logic games and numerical distributions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and if you're taking the January test or the February test or really any LSAT going forward, that is a great episode to go through because we talk about how to recognize distributions, how they work, how powerful they are. And as I've said in the Crystal Ball, I think from day one, every single LSAT has a game pretty much that deals with numbers based upon numerical distributions. Every game really has numerical distribution built into it, some of them more important than others. So this is something that you have to understand at a foundational level. That's episode 119.
Yeah, and very often the trickiest of the 4 games is one that centers around numerical distributions. So it's not just an important skill, it can be a life-saving skill when it comes to this. And I guess Dave, we must have been in just a creative zone or something, or we had a break between test recaps, because 2 episodes later, we had another, I think, somewhat inspired one, inspired by you, about Pyrrhic victories and how to avoid them on this test. If you don't know what we're talking about in Pyrrhic victories, we don't need to get back into it. Go listen to it. But that was episode 121. A lot of good advice about how to, I think, avoid some commonplace, not just mistakes, but mistakes that might have the allure of a victory at first.
Yeah, an episode that came out of me reading an article about football. The gist of it is,
That's what it was.
Don't focus on winning the battle, or don't get so wrapped up in that you forget about winning the war.
Right.
So that's where we're going with that. But John, this was actually kind of an interesting year because one of the things that we got, I think from Spotify, which is just one of multiple channels that we use to distribute this podcast, was that we've passed on Spotify at least over 1 million unique listens all time of this podcast. And in the past year, over 321,000 unique listens, meaning if somebody listened to the podcast and then came back and listened to that episode again, which happens a lot, that didn't get counted. These were individuals listening to individual episodes. And passing 1 million, I think that's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool. We don't say that so much to brag as to say, like, for anybody listening to this, thank you. It means the world to us that we're putting something out that apparently is being responded to. I hope appreciated, but we certainly appreciate you for it.
Yeah, it's an LSAT podcast. I always think if we get 10 people to listen to it, it's a huge success.
Yeah.
So to hear numbers like that is like, what? That's crazy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thanks, guys, for all of you out there.
On that, let's talk about 2022. And
All right.
The interesting thing was that last year, John, what we did was we actually went through the entire year in chronological fashion. This is what happened in January. This is what happened in February. We had dates. We could see all this stuff. And as we were putting it together this year, that's how I originally at least laid it all out. And then you and I were talking and we decided to change this up a little bit because we noticed that there were 5 major themes that dominated this year. And so what we have done is we have divided it into these 5 themes and then kind of talked about the chronology inside of each one. And I will say that at least as far as how those 5 themes work out, these were the 5. And then we'll get into it more specifically. First off, there were cycle updates where we looked at it and said, how were things actually going in the admissions cycle? Ebbs and flows of that. Then there were the individual LSATs from month to month, how things changed there, how each test went, problems that we had. There was a huge conversation around the ABA making the LSAT an optional exam and going test optional entirely. There's another one about rankings in U.S. News and World Report and how the rankings work and law schools withdrawing from that. And then the last one was really a lot of conversation around the logic game section possibly being removed from this test and analytical reasoning kind of explorations that they did in terms of looking at this. So these are the 5 themes that we're going to talk about and recap here very briefly. But that was, it's weird that you can look at a year and think, boy, these themes just rose to the top in such a dominant fashion.
Yeah, every month something seemed to jump out to the front, but it was always one of those 5 things, sometimes multiple of those 5 things.
Yeah, so
where do you want to start? You want to start with the cycle?
I want to start with the cycle because, as we turn each year, one of the things that we always do at the beginning is we end up talking about the numbers. And so an LSAT cycle and really an admissions cycle, the way it's looked at from an LSAT perspective is it goes from July 1st to June 30th. They moved it around a few times, but this is what they've kind of settled on. And so when you start talking about retaking the LSAT and so forth, once you get to the end of June, a whole new year of testing opens up. And the admission cycle is tracked on that as well. All the numbers that we use are based upon that. And as you kind of like look at what was happening at the start of the year, it looked as if you had a very slow cycle that was actually going on. It was still up versus 2 years ago. We still had a scoring bubble in place, although it was getting a little bit better. It was worse than 2 years ago. And one of the things that was very interesting to me was watching the numbers of LSAT takers as the first 6 months of 2022 got underway, because they fell off a cliff a little bit. We saw a decrease overall compared to the prior year. We saw fewer first-time test takers. And so the year started off relatively slow from admissions decisions, and it had been kind of normal compared to the prior year, and then it just slowly got weaker and weaker from the number of test takers, which was good if you were an applicant, but a lot of the test takers had already been in place from the end of the prior year.
Yeah, I mean, it's still up, I would say, from a couple years back, but certainly once it started to slow down or taper, really, I think a lot of people were pleased to see that, at least on the applicant side. So there you go. What about that scoring bubble? I get asked about this constantly.
Same thing.
How do you see that? Yeah. Right.
It was a little bit better, but it was still worse than it was 2 years ago. What we see is during the pandemic, you had a real score bubble that actually was created by, we think, the LSAT flex, and it eased up as we went through the last cycle. And so we were hoping that it would continue to ease this year, and we'll get to it in just a second. And in fact, let's just kind of, recap the entire year here. As we get into July, we switch to a new cycle. So now we're in the middle of July 2022. The new cycle begins, and it really ended. It kept on in the same vein. Right away when we started getting numbers, the number of applicants was down over 10%.
Yeah, almost 12%, right?
Yeah, it had ended down 11.7%.
There you go.
And then immediately it started up and it was down 14%, I think 14.4%. And as I watched that, I will say this, as the year went on, it slowly but steadily crept back towards the prior year. I think we ended this year down about 4.1% on this cycle as compared to the prior one. So when it started off at more than 14% down, it ended up only 4% down. You can see that it caught up as things went on. What didn't really drop, which is what you wanted to have happen a little bit, was that scoring bubble. In fact, scores in the 170, 180 range are basically flat compared to the prior year, which means that at that level, things have gotten more competitive because you have 4.1% fewer applicants, but you have essentially the same number of 170 to 180 scores. So there's more of them relative to the overall pool. What dropped, though, was the scores in the 160s.
Right.
Those were down 9 to 10% or so. And so they dropped at a faster rate than the applicant pool did. So it got a little bit easier in the 160s and a little harder in the 170s overall. And that was how that year kind of played out. Was we had a big drop off in the first half, and then in the second half, it started off looking like a big drop off and then slowly caught back up. But our scoring bubble at the very top didn't go away.
Yeah, I know this gets a little confusing for people, sometimes for me, because when you and I talk about years, we talk about January to December. When LSAC talks about years, they talk really about July 1st through June 30th.
Exactly.
So we're 6 months off as we describe these things. But really what we're talking about here is that July to June cycle typically.
Yeah, in that vein, 2022 actually has parts of two cycles. It has the end of the 2021-2022 cycle and the beginning of the 2022-2023 cycle. So we're right now in the middle of 2022. Yep, 2023. And what you're seeing is, like we just said, down 4.1%. Scoring bubble still persists, especially at the very top. And what this means for law schools is the same thing we've seen the last 2 years. Decisions are being rendered very slowly.
Right.
They're taking their time as they try to figure out exactly how the numbers are going to play out ultimately. Although I will say this, in the midst of all that, when you talk about admissions cycles and decisions, one of the things that we were able to do was that we got together with Spivey Consulting and worked with them on the Law School Admissions Bible, which I now consider the fourth of the apocryphal LSAT Bibles. This one's just on the admissions side, and we released that. Really, it was kind of like November, December that we released that. And so that is now out there. So if you're still applying to law school, you still have questions, we cover so many things in there that are really useful. Go to the PowerScore website. You can grab it there. And then when we get to the end, John, we'll talk a little bit about how we see 2023 as a year going forward. So we'll come back to this cycle conversation. But that was one of the big themes. We kept talking about the cycles. It kept coming up. Right. The numbers rise and fall. And obviously, I report on those constantly on my Twitter feed. So if that's interesting to you, give me a follow.
I imagine anybody listening to this would have to find it interesting. Nothing's going to be more relevant to what happens to you than understanding the nature of how the cycle moves.
I'm sure they're just here to listen to your dulcet tones.
Oh, that could be it.
The mellifluous voice of John Denning.
It should be a one-man show.
Good. That means I have less work to do in my life. I don't take that as an insult or in any kind of negative way. I'm out.
All right. So I think that covers the first half of the cycle discussion. And like you said, we're going to make some predictions about next year. But we'll conclude really with a number of predictions, not just about cycle, but about maybe things that could happen to the LSAT and our own plans internally, PowerScore stuff. Table that, though, and let's talk about the 2022 LSATs. There were 9 of them. I don't know if you remember, Dave, but there were 9.
I don't remember much. And I think this is partially why we sparked the idea of doing it thematically, because we didn't want to keep coming back and be like, hey, there's an LSAT in January. Then there was one in February. Then there was one in March. We didn't really want to kind of go down that particular pathway. But as you point out, there were 9 of them. There were a couple interesting things, though, when we look back on those 9 tests. Aside from the first thing being they were all on Friday and Saturday as the 2 main test administration days. So they shortened the testing. In the past, they'd had Sunday sometimes as a main day. They'd even added other days before. These were all 2-day tests, and I think that had a lot to do with the size of those exams.
And I think they had learned from experience that if you can do it in 2 days and don't need a third, do it in 2.
Makes it cheaper for them.
That's exactly right.
There were 2 tests, though, that stood out, I think, to both you and I, just on a very specific sense. The first one was the April LSAT. Mm-hmm. And the reason this one stood out to us was that as we got out into, I think it was the Saturday for that test, there was a complete catastrophe, a huge server outage. Tons of people were knocked out during the middle of the LSAT, or they were unable to get in, if not for hours, sometimes at all. Yeah. And LSAC was forced to add multiple makeup days. And they originally wanted to add Tuesday and the following Tuesday. And I know you and I were complaining to them heavily, like, add Saturday. You can't just do Tuesday and Tuesday. That's great for the people who don't have to work. But What about the working people?
Yeah, we lobbied really hard for this. Unfortunately, we won. But it was a Saturday outage, and they were trying to make them go take the test on a weekday. It doesn't make any sense.
That's exactly right. So that was one of the big ones. That was probably the worst LSAT of the year in terms of systemic, catastrophic outages. We didn't see a whole lot of that, though, the rest of the tests. But it only takes one really bad scenario like that for everybody in the world to get furious. And as we've said many times in other kind of forums, if you have any problems, even if it doesn't affect anyone else, but it affects you, it's a terrible experience. It makes you it affects the outcomes, and that's not fair. In this case, it was hundreds, probably thousands of people who were affected.
Yeah, you and I just lived in damage control for about 48 hours. It was pretty bad.
It was terrible.
But again, they ultimately did the right thing and added some makeup days. This stuff happens, and there's nothing they can do to control the global internet.
Not as long as they are, in this case, forced to use a different server, which I think was ultimately identified as the problem. And then they're also using a third party like ProctorU. Mm-hmm. They cause problems as well. But I think even if LSAC was overseeing it themselves, I'm not sure it would be all that much better.
It's hard to say. Yeah. There was another interesting test development, and in this case, far less catastrophe, which was the June test. As you recall, also a sort of Saturday surprise. This was the test where, for some people, about half the people who tested on Saturday afternoon, LSAC inserted a fourth section experimental, testing some new logic game items. And there were a few things that were interesting about this. First is they told people it was experimental in real time. So before you started the section, they told you it wouldn't count. It's not how this normally goes. Of course, the only reason to have an experimental section is if people can't tell the difference. In this case, they could. And of course, they were testing content that wasn't actual LSAT content. It was identifiably different, which was the point.
Yeah. And this was a huge surprise. Nobody was warned about that. They did talk to us as it was happening, so we had a sense of what was going on. But we'll come back and cover this in a little bit more detail later, because this gets into the analytical reasoning field study and the future of the logic game section on this exam. But that was incredibly notable. And think about when they did that too. They did that in June. They didn't do it in one of the big tests like August, September, October, any of the ones that are being used. They made it so that if somebody was thrown off by it, they still had options thereafter to retake the test. One other thing I'll point out about all these LSATs, it's not really an LSAT, test kind of related thing, but starting in, I think it was early August, they made score preview available to all test takers. Mm-hmm. And I think that was another big development, because they had made it available to first-time test takers for a while, and then all of a sudden, unannounced, they didn't tell anybody, they made it available to everybody. I love that, and I tell everyone now, I'm just like, get it? It's peace of mind. If something goes wrong, you don't have to have a score on your record that you didn't want. It's one of those situations that just gives you coverage.
Yeah, while we're talking policy change milestones, and looking back at calendars, in mid-May, they changed another policy. You may recall they increased the price. They upped the price of the LSAT from $200 to $215 back last May. People who are just taking it now, I'm sure, wouldn't have much awareness of the fact that it did used to be cheaper. But yeah, about 7 months ago, we saw this happen, 8 months ago.
Yeah, and I'm sure I'll mention this later on, but when they release all that information later on about the next testing sessions and they come out with new registrations, probably in May of this upcoming year here, the year we're in, I'll bet you $5 they raise the price again.
No bet. I'll bet you $5 it's more than $5.
Take that. Not taking that.
Take that. Yeah, it's funny. May is when they tend to announce new registrations. It's also when they tend to make price changes. June is when they like to play around. June was when they first launched comparative reading, way back in June 2007. This June is where they first started testing some new games items, experimentally, of course. I would also bet, if we're doing it, that when we do see new games introduced, it'll be a June test.
Also, a bet I won't take, because I think you're right about that. So however, we'll talk more about that.
At least there's some predictability to this.
Yeah, well, June's a perfect test for them for a lot of different reasons. But we'll come back to that point, because I think that's worthwhile to get into, as to whether or not we'll see a change in logic games coming this year. And you'll just have to wait till we get there. One other thing, though, John, you and I always make predictions in our crystal ball about, test likely options that they would choose to repeat. And usually we have maybe 1, 2, sometimes even 3 tests where we're like, we think this is what they're going to do. We know there were 9 LSATs. How was our performance?
Oh boy. Yeah, I wondered if you were going to bring this up as we were sitting there making predictions a second ago. I went back and actually tracked this really recently, because part of what we try to do is we introduce new crystal balls, and we'll see how we do next weekend, is we want to make sure that we're being as accurate as we can. Otherwise, we should probably stop. So our credibility is always kind of on the line here, and it's important to both of us, I think, that we maintain it. In this case, we're in really good shape, Dave. Of the 9 tests this year, and we predicted all 9, we got 7 of them right. 7 of the 9 tests were within the prediction sets that we said were going to happen. The 2 that and I even hesitate to use the word miss, but the 2 that we didn't nail were because they double dipped from old exams. They weren't reuses of new things or unused things. It was a second or sometimes tertiary use. And that's impossible to foresee.
Yeah, I think we actually, when we do that in the crystal ball, I've said one of the assumptions is that they won't double dip, because they'd never done it before. So when they went ahead and did it twice in relatively short order, I think you and I were like, that's not fair to us, because we were assuming that you weren't going to do that. But 7 of 9, aside from the Star Trekian kind of reference there, works for me.
I don't know what that means.
It's so remote. We're not even getting into
that's obscure even for me, and I am pretty obscure. But yeah, so that's how at least the year shaped up in terms of what we were expecting to see, in terms of what actually happened. And again, some of the highlight moments, aside from just individual administrations. One other interesting thing happened to close out the year, which was in November. We weren't sure if this was going to occur, but they released a new LSAT, PT 93+, which was an old test form originally from February 2011, and I think LR from February 2012. This was a test form they had originally used recently in June 2020. So that caught us a little by surprise, but we were certainly excited to see it. We were able to include discussions of that in our latest crystal ball, the one that's out now for the January and February tests.
Yeah, and if you're wondering what the crystal ball is that we're talking about, that's the webinar that we do where we cover about what we think they're going to do on the upcoming tests. We make predictions about problem sets and so forth. If you want to view that, it is free. You can go to our website, powerscore.com/LSAT. You can actually sign up on a form there. It doesn't cost you anything, and they'll send you a link where you can actually watch it. I wrote a blog post. I'd been asked so much. It's like, does it really help? Does it make a difference? And so I put together a blog post. If you go to our blog and just look up crystal ball, you'll see it. It really talks about, is it useful? Is it helpful? And I pull in a bunch of student comments, talk about some of the predictions that we've made in the past, how that can be helpful. I kind of, I think, proved the point. And now when people ask me about it, I'm like, read this. Makes my life better. But going back to your point about 7 out of 9 tests, I don't think we can operate at a higher level. We put ourselves on the line every single time we do this. I don't see anyone else out there even thinking about trying it because it's just such a difficult process. And the fact that we're still able to get as close as we are to something that should be completely unpredictable. We should not be able to do this. The fact that we continue to be able to do it amazes me. We'll stop when I feel like, hey, this isn't useful anymore. But right now it is still extremely useful. So I'm really happy about that.
It's a high wire act, juggling chainsaws. It's insane. But if we were 2 or 3 out of 9, I think we'd probably need to dial it back.
Yeah, I think we'd think about it. Also, that high wire act is juggling chainsaws over a pit of alligators and sharks. So
pretty much, yeah. While on fire. So yeah, this is. I was pretty pleased to see that. I love to see the podcast numbers. I love when we're right. It's been a gratifying couple of days. Put it that way.
It certainly has. And let's talk about something that's been on a lot of people's minds, and that would be the U.S. News rankings. And interestingly enough, from a chronology standpoint, this really started, the conversation for us with rankings last year started in March. Mm-hmm. Last March 28th, the new U.S. News rankings came out, and we always do a podcast episode. We will most assuredly do one this year because I will be very interested to see how that is. And, there were some things that were really interesting. For example, Harvard dropped down to 4th in the last ranking. Chicago moved up to 3rd. You don't often see a whole lot of changes in the top 14. We recapped them all in podcast episode 106. And you would think at that point, that's pretty much it. They release the rankings, you talk about it, you're done for the year. But that is not really what happened, because later on, as the year went on, we got to really November or so, and all of a sudden Yale made an announcement and said, guys, we're not going to participate in the U.S. News rankings any longer. And that was a huge kind of an earthquake throughout the entire rankings field, because it wasn't just them. Immediately after they said what they had to say, a whole bunch of other schools pulled out.
Yeah, in fact, we saw this almost avalanche of schools following in Yale's wake. I don't remember the exact order of things, but it was several of the top schools within a day or two announced it. I believe, what's the current count? Do you know how many have withdrawn so far, Dave?
I think it's 21 officially have said we are withdrawing, and there's 5 that are staying in. I think it was Harvard was second, then Berkeley was in there. It's interesting. I was doing an interview with the Daily Californian yesterday, and as I was talking to the guy, he's like, I just got an email from Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of the Berkeley Law School. And he was like, let me read it to you, which was kind of cool to hear it really kind of like directly from the reporter that was talking about it. But these 21 schools that withdrew, we kind of went through this in episode 123. We talked about what it means for them to have done that. All they've done is they have said, we're not going to submit information in response to U.S. News surveys, polls, questions, and what have you. And that's an interesting thing, because a lot of people reported this in the mass media as, that's it for the rankings. Yale's not going to participate. Harvard, all these schools are pulling out. They don't have the ability to do that. They just can say, we're not going to give you information. And we knew that what that meant was twofold. First off, U.S. News was going to continue to rank schools.
Sure.
They make money off this. It's a big name kind of branding thing. They weren't going to stop. 2 days later, they said, yeah, we're going to keep on ranking schools. We also knew that it was going to mean a methodology change, because some of the data that U.S. News was compiling was proprietary. It could only come from the schools. So if they weren't going to get it from all the schools, likely what they were going to do was either eliminate or de-emphasize reliance upon those particular measurements. And that's essentially what happened. In fact, as the new year turned here, John, what did we get from U.S. News?
I think it was January 2nd, yeah.
Yeah, which really super annoyed me, because I'm like, that was, the federal holiday for New Year's. And I'm like, I'm not working today. And then I start getting all these messages about, oh, U.S. News announces this. I'm like, now I got to work. But there's a big meeting in San Diego this year for the American Association of Law Schools, AALS. And U.S. News goes to that meeting every year. And they needed to put out a statement before they just got, eviscerated at the actual live meeting. So they put that out as the whole thing starts up during that week. It started actually on Tuesday, I believe, maybe Wednesday. And so they've put that out, and they've said indeed that they are going to listen to some of the changes that have been requested by the schools. They are going to adjust the methodology, and they'll release more information. And I can tell you, we'll probably end up talking about this a lot more as the year goes on. A lot of the schools have responded by saying, that's great, but we don't know what the heck you're going to do, so that's not enough. And in fact, Erwin Chemerinsky's statement said exactly that. He's like, this is just so vague as to not really be all that useful. Great, we want you to change. You tell us you're hearing us, but you won't tell us exactly what the changes are other than in the most vague terms. That's not good enough.
Yeah, I also couldn't help but find it a little comical that Harvard falls to 4th and immediately opts out. Chicago climbs to 3rd, immediately says they're staying in. It's like the winners stay put, and the losers take their ball and go home.
Yeah, I had a lot of comments. I've been giving interviews this week to various legal publications, student newspapers and stuff like that. And a lot of the questions are, how much is it going to change?
Right.
I'll be really interested to see how much it changes. There's going to have to be some changes. But as I've said elsewhere, if they make wholesale changes to this and the rankings are suddenly completely shaken up, I think they've destroyed their business model, and they've certainly destroyed their credibility. Oh, your rankings previously, just because you had a little bit of extra information, it's about 10, 15% of the information that they were using, made one set of rankings, but now it's totally different, even though it's only 1 year later. No, I will crucify them if that is the case.
Yeah, when Yale slips to 12th or something.
Yeah, or the 58th school becomes the 13th.
Right.
I'm like, it's not going to happen that way. I know some people are very excited. Like, I went to a school that's like 18th and we're going to be top 5. I'm like, no, they can't do that. Their credibility will be shot.
Yeah,
I think they know that. They're smart enough not to do that, but that tells you exactly the value of the rankings. It's completely 100% manipulated. It's the formula they make. They can figure out whatever outcome that they want. I'm not saying they're doing it that way, but I'm also not saying they're not doing it that way.
Very diplomatic. But yeah, you always have to take the rankings with a grain of salt. And if they start to move around too much this year, it'll be a boulder of salt.
Well, it just goes to show you that one small change can have these huge effects. And really, should that be the case? No. Some of the changes they're talking about are good. We'll get into it a little bit more later. Let's go to the next big theme, which was really, I felt almost hand in hand. You saw a lot of news articles address both.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the rankings, it was the test optional aspect of what, and now this was not U.S. News or the law schools, this was the American Bar Association, the ABA. And if you're not familiar, they're the ones that oversee the operations of law schools. They're the ones that set the standards for what they can and cannot do. And back on April 25th, they released a statement proposing new language, making the LSAT an optional part of the admissions process and really making testing an optional part.
Yeah, for people who don't know the context here, the LSAT has been a required, or some entrance exam has been required for any ABA approved or accredited law school. So you couldn't just go to law school without having one of these tests under your belt. What they're talking about doing now is changing that policy so that law schools could choose for themselves what it is that they do or don't care or demand in terms of accepting students.
Yeah, for years it was the LSAT and the LSAT alone. And then the GRE was able to kind of like lobby their way in. And then they changed the language. It's called Standard 503, actually, which is the one that governs whether or not an admissions test is required and which test. For years, it specifically said the LSAT. Then it was removed to say a test. And so they kind of had finalized that language relatively recently. And then all of a sudden, the committee, the subsection that's in charge of this, started saying, hey, we think we would like to make it optional. And they proposed that. And then over the rest of the year, John, they had a series of votes.
Yeah, it continued to be
moved it
discussed
from one committee to another. And so in May, on May 5th, they took the very first step in eliminating a full testing requirement by recommending it be dropped and said, all right, we're going to put it out for comment. And so over the summer, they kind of like released some revision language and sent it out for public comment. And they got like 100+ comments. It was one of the most commented on revisions in the last number of years. A bunch of people for it, a bunch of people against it. You can imagine who was against it. LSAC, the GRE people, they were all like, no, you need a test still. Because they realized all of a sudden it was like no longer about them, but that their entire business model was under fire.
Yeah. I should point out, this isn't like just a Facebook post or something where any stranger can show up and give his 2 cents. This was something for like industry people, for schools, for admissions deans and committees, for test providers and things.
Although I will say any person can show up and give their 2 cents.
I thought they had to have some kind of qualification to weigh in on this.
I've read almost all the comments.
In that case, I can't believe it was only 100 comments.
I don't think people know where it is or how to actually submit it. It's not a form that you go fill out, but you'd have these individuals who are like, I've been a lawyer for 40 years and this is necessary. And then you'd have other people like, it's so hard to study for, who are, clearly not as experienced or lawyers or anything like that.
Well,
it is sent out for public comment. Anyone can comment. And there were actually more comments in favor of keeping it.
Yeah.
But one of the things the ABA said when they met was, we don't care how many comments there are. That's not, that doesn't prove the point. It's about the quality of what's being said. And almost all the comments in favor of keeping it were very much the same. So they were able to kind of lump them into one sum and say, we don't care.
Interesting. Well, I take that back. I was mistaken. I didn't think I thought it was publicly visible, but not just publicly open to.
Yep. It's on the ABA website. It's hard as heck to find, but if you poke around, you can start to find it, and you can see all the comments and all the different groups, and who's weighing in how. And it kind of continued. There was, they finalized what they were doing in September. They closed the comment period. They said they were going to move it along, and then on November 8th, they got to the legal section and they voted on it again. And I think if I recall correctly, it was 15-1 was the vote.
It was lopsided. Yeah, really lopsided. You and I both were there and watched it through some sort of web stream.
And I thought it was going to be closer than 15-1. I knew it was going to pass. And when I say pass, meaning that test optional would be approved. And that's exactly what happens. And so even now, it's not done. It doesn't get finalized until, I think, February 2023. They got the full house of the ABA. We think they'll pass it, but even if they don't, it'll go back to the same subsection, and it's quite clear the subsection will pass it. They have the power to override the full house, which is weird to me, but that's the way that it is. I will say this, though. The test optional aspect does not come into play until 2025 at the earliest. So this won't affect you this year or next year for sure. This is something that isn't going to be a school's choice until 2025. And a lot of schools will still continue to use the LSAT. That was clear from the comments.
Yeah, that was a very last minute change. I think it was supposed to be fall 2024 originally. And somebody voted or suggested it be moved back a year. If anybody wants to hear us go on about this further, and I find that hard to believe, we've done 2 podcast episodes on this. The first back in April, which was episode 109, when we first were hearing about this language and the test optional possibility. And then the second in November, which was podcast episode 123, after the vote had passed and what that was going to mean.
That is the case. And that brings us to our final theme of 2022, and that was the controversy over logic games conceivably being replaced. And if you're not familiar with it, officially, the logic game section is known as analytical reasoning, We just call it logic games because that's what they really are. They're logic puzzles, they're logic games, and that's become the default for what everybody refers to this section as. But officially, that's the AR or analytical reasoning section, which is distinct from the LR or logical reasoning section. And there were really two big pieces of this. We've known for a while that there's a possibility they would switch out what they're doing with logic games. There was a lawsuit, the Bino versus LSAC lawsuit a number of years ago. Again, search it. It's on our podcast. We've talked all about it. We talked to the lawyer who represented Angelo Bino, talking about how LSAC had gotten themselves into a corner. And by losing that lawsuit, we're in a position where it was really unfair to test takers who had sight issues to be forced to use paper and to have to rely upon diagramming. And so this has been something where it was said that by 2024, LSAC had agreed to make a change. And there's always some, clauses that allow you to get out of these types of things, but that's really where things actually stood. So that's still a couple years off at this point. But what's happening is that in advance of that, LSAC is making kind of like forays into looking at options. They're testing things out. And the first thing they did is one that we've already mentioned back on June 10th, on the June 10th and 11th LSAT. On that second day, on Saturday, at the end of the day, a whole bunch of test takers got to section 4, and it said right there, this is experimental. Mm-hmm. It is analytical reasoning and it is experimental. And what they did is they ran a live surprise test on a whole bunch of test takers where they really, what they were doing was like, well, let's run and see how people perform on this, which is the appropriate protocol for trying to figure out what's valid and invalid, is to use it inside of a live fire test. Of course, it was a huge surprise to everybody.
Mm-hmm. And it led to a huge amount of bickering and controversy, and some people upset that they were caught off guard, and other people upset that they had to do 4 sections as though all 4 counted. Nobody's happy. Nobody's ever happy.
The happiest person was the one who's like, I just crushed the first 3 sections when I'm getting tired. And then they're like, oh, good, I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. And then they added a survey at the end of the test for those experimental people too, which I thought was kind of funny. You do 4 sections, and then they expect you to sit there through a survey too.
Nobody wants to do their survey, but they were taking a look at some different question formats. As it turned out, a lot of people were able to do that section in like 8 to 12, 13 minutes or so. It wasn't difficult. It was kind of like a baby LSAT logic game section to some extent. I think they're just looking to see how people perform on certain things. And they can say, all right, people who got a 150 on this test perform this way and so forth. And then later on, as the year went on, they announced this fall, they're like, we're going to do a formal separate test now. And they called it the Analytical Reasoning Field Study. And they did that on December 16th and 17th. And that was 3 sections, 2 of which were in the new format of what they're testing. And again, this is a test. That's not what the final choice is. And then 1 real section. And so, again, we told everybody, go do the field test. You're getting a real section using ProctorU. You'll get the section results, and you'll get the section back when they release that, because they're going to put it out. So we know that's still coming here. But that's more in the vein of them testing things out. And that was the other big theme, is that caused a lot of controversy and uncertainty. Will logic games still be here? Is it changing? How much is it changing?
Well, if we're going to talk about that, maybe we should start to look at the year ahead.
I think we should, because it's going to go hand in hand with that.
Yeah, that's kind of a perfect little handoff.
All right, so that recaps 2022, the big themes that we saw. Let's talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen in 2023.
Yeah, and let's start where I think all of us should, which is the LSATs themselves. Here's the first thing I'll say, and this feels like a really safe bet. I don't see the LSAT changing at all in the next 12 months. It's going to be the same format, 3 scored plus 1 experimental. It's still going to be digital. It's still going to be at home. They may allow some in-person testing at some point if there's enough demand for it, which I honestly do think would be a factor. And obviously, if they feel comfortable and it's safe.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing is right now it's cost effective. It's generally efficient for them to deliver it at home in a digital format. We know that there's a number of people who just don't like it that way or don't have the right testing set up to make that an optimal experience. I've heard rumor that they'd consider the in-person thing. I don't think that'll happen until after June is over, but with the way the pandemic's going, or the end of the pandemic, whatever it may be. You can never seem to tell what the health authorities are saying about it at any given moment. Right now, it seems like people are acting fairly normally. I know you and I are out and about and doing the kind of stuff that we'd wanted to do the whole time. I could see them saying, look, we'll make limited seats available for an experience that's in person if you're a person who needs that. But I think overall, what we're looking at here is the LSAT for 2023 will continue to be the LSAT as we know it today. I don't see them adding additional sections. I don't see them taking away sections. That also means that when we talk about logic games, are they suddenly going to spring a whole new type of game section on us? And the answer to that is a resounding no.
Yeah, in fact, I think they've even put out statements to this exact effect. Like, this is going to be ongoing for quite some time. These studies, these field tests, maybe these surprise experimental sections. We're in the beginning stages of them figuring out what to do. They're nowhere near implementing this.
Yeah, they made a comment about that December field study, and it says the December study is just one of many studies that we have completed and will be completing for quite some time. Now listen to their language there, because that is made with care. As part of the research, we're collecting a body of evidence to make our decision. Quite some time. They're not going to all of a sudden say in 2 months, it's time for us to go and do this. Here's the thing they also said about potential changes to the LSAT. And this is borne out by our historical experience with them. They usually announce changes a good 6 months in advance. I would expect a major change of this magnitude to be announced at least 6 months in advance. And they say, if something were to materialize where a decision was made to assess analytical reasoning skills with different questions or by a different route, meaning a new AR or logic game section, we would absolutely communicate that many months in advance at the absolute latest. So they're going out of their way to make it clear this will not be a Sunday surprise where all of a sudden you just get a whole new section and you had just a couple weeks. They will release materials beforehand explaining what the changes are. They will release practice and study materials as well. I have that directly from their admin. So those of you who are taking the LSAT in 2023, you're not going to see a new or different, or as many people have thought, easier logic game section. We don't expect to see this anytime before June 2024.
Yeah, that was my date too. I was thinking June 2024 is probably when we would see this kick in. Certainly not much sooner than that.
You know what we'll probably see, John, is we'll see one of those 50-50 administrations where half the test takers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For those who don't know, back when they were transitioning from paper to digital, there was a test where you would go in to take it in person, but you didn't know what you were going to get. Your test center would either be tablets or paper. Yeah, it was a lottery. Yep.
And I think that's what they'll do, although they'll just deliver these digitally. So some people will get the old school logic game section and some people will get the new school version of it.
Was that July 2019? Is that when it happened? It sounds right to me.
That was 100 years ago, John. It was not 2019.
It feels that way, doesn't it? But yeah, so more of the same through this year, although fewer test dates this year, thank goodness.
Yeah, so let's talk about the admissions cycle and how the end of this current admissions cycle is going to look, and maybe even how next cycle will end up looking, because that's obviously a big concern for everybody as they kind of look at the upcoming year. Right now, we're having a cycle that is returning to what last year's was, although it's a little bit slower. I think probably at the upper schools, because of the fact that we have like this growing bubble in the 170s, we're going to see LSAT scores in the top 14 schools probably stay the same. I think the medians will stay there at the 50th and 75th percentile level. Because we're seeing a drop in test takers in the 160s, I think we're probably going to see the 25th percentile medians at a lot of schools, but not all of them. The lower the school is in the top 14, the more likely this is the case, drop by a point. So kind of like a mixed bag of results depending upon where you are. I think every one of these schools in the T14 is going to do their absolute best, or damnedest, however you want to describe it, to keep that 50th and 75th where it is. A bunch of them will be like, we can't keep the 25th where it is. We have to drop it one because they've got fewer test takers in that range, relatively speaking.
Yeah. The big dream for a lot of people, like, are we going to see a 2 or 3 point drop at some of these good schools, though? Not this year, you're not.
No, we'll have to see about the following year. I don't think next year, the cycle that starts up for fall of next year and then moves into the following year, I don't think that cycle is going to be worse than this year, barring some kind of social upheaval where all of a sudden a ton more people start applying to law school. Barring, if everything stays the same and barring some kind of misfortune like that, I think what we're going to see is next year is going to be either the same or slightly better than what we have. I don't think it'll be worse next year. This cycle, though, continues to be slow, so just be aware of that. The medians probably that have been published just recently, the ABA 509s came out. Those medians at the 50th and 75th will probably stay the same. GPAs probably will hold roughly steady. We've had great inflation. GPA's medians have been rising for the past decade or so. I think those will probably be about the same as they have been this past year. So those are kind of the baselines that you can use as you're looking at schools and thinking about where you fit in.
Good deal. All right, so I think that covers the cycle pretty well. The big question that I'm hearing a lot is, when are we going to get new LSAT dates? When is LSAC going to announce some new test administration dates?
All right, so we've got dates all the way through, I think, June of 2023.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the new cycle starts on July 1st, 2023. And typically what they'll do is in January, so in just a couple of weeks, we should see the dates for the next cycle get posted. So that would be from July of 2023 all the way through June of 2024. Now, you won't be able to register for those tests immediately. Typically, the registration won't open for about 4 more months after that. In this past year, it was done in May. That's about when I would expect it here. About May 2023, probably the middle of the month, we will see the registration open for all the test dates in that 2023-2024 cycle. If they're going to raise prices, and one has to think that there's a decent chance of that, that's when they would do it as well. They don't do it when they post the dates. They do it when they open the registration. And usually any other policy changes that are coming are done about that time as well.
Makes sense. So January, we should know when the test will be. May, we should know, well, people should be able to register for when they want to take the tests. And then somewhere right in the middle of that, late March, early April, we'll get these rankings that we've been talking about. So a series of hopefully fortunate events. Month to month.
I can see a lot of podcasts in our.
I was just planning out our podcast schedule, one after another.
We'll do a full recap. One of the interesting theories I've seen floated now about those rankings is that U.S. News may not actually release their methodology.
Oh.
Since it's intended to be entirely on public information, if they release their methodology, anybody can produce rankings instantaneously when they get the public information for next year.
Yeah, we talked about that article they released a few days ago, but it seems like they may keep a little bit of this closer to the vest as well.
I will say that if they don't release the methodology, the rankings, which are already questionably valid, are completely invalid at that point.
I like this. I hope they hear it. Puts a little pressure on them.
They need to release the information 100%. If you do not do it, it's just a black box and who knows what they're measuring. They don't even have to have a methodology at that point. They can just list the schools the way they want. There has to be a way to measure this. So if they don't have that, we will go out and crucify them over that as well.
I tend to think transparency is a good thing in just about every aspect, including ours. Let's close this thing out, Dave, as we wrap up what we're kind of looking forward to this year with some PowerScore plans, because I know you and I both have some exciting stuff ahead of us this year. And let's talk about it. I want people to be aware of what's coming.
Yeah, that was a smooth transition. I really liked your transparency pick up there.
Thank you very much.
Well, there's a number of plans for us, obviously, and for LSAT takers, probably the first thing that they'll see is that we have been reconfiguring our on-demand course. And so our new on-demand course will be coming probably mid-spring or so. You've been doing, I think, the legwork largely on that, although I've contributed as well. We've been recording new content. We've been reconfiguring the course to kind of change it around a little bit, make it a little bit easier to digest, more of a short video format. I think you and I are both pretty excited about how that's going to play out.
Yeah, it's going to be expanded. It's going to be a lot more navigable. It's going to be better, frankly. And not just because it's you and me at the heart of it, but just because I think we've completely re-engineered it for the student experience. And I'm really, really excited to release that.
Yeah, and there's 2 other pieces that go along with that. Like, we didn't just rebuild the on-demand course itself. We've done that, but we're rebuilding our analytics engine, that runs behind all of our courses, all of our tutoring, everything that we do LSAT with, to make the presentation, I think, number one, cleaner, to optimize it too, so that the feedback that we're giving to students is even better. Already there's a lot of good things that we're able to do and provide as feedback, but the new analytics that's being remade, I think we're making it more useful and making the presentation, importantly, even easier to use. And then on top of that, John, we'll put out a mobile app a little bit later this year that will allow all this to be accessed, as well as our other courses and analytics and so forth. So just making it one more tool, whether you're on a mobile device, whether you're on a tablet, just easier to access all of this, have it on the go. We've been wanting to do this for a while. It's I've been seeing the wireframe mock-ups and so forth. They look good. So pretty excited about that.
Well, that's going to be cool. Basically, no matter how students want to access and digest this material, it's going to be better and I think broader than anything we've done before. So that's pretty cool.
And as these things come out, we'll obviously mention it here on the podcast, on Twitter, or wherever else. Looks good. I'm sure there'll be like blog resources that we mention and list out. So if you are one of our students, it'll update for you, or we'll tell you that it's actually coming. If you're not, or you're thinking about becoming a student, and we hope you are, you'll be able to see that in any of the social channels that we throw out there. But even then, we're not done, John, at least in the law school space.
I know, this is going to be a weird sentence 2 years ago, but now it makes a lot of sense. We've got a new GRE course coming out as well. It's also going to be on demand, extremely comprehensive. But now that the GRE is becoming more and more, I think, central to what a lot of people's law school application plans are, that's going to be a vital piece as well for people who listen to this.
That's exactly the case. Sometimes people would be like, GRE, what does that have to do with law school? Well, we think that pretty much every law school is going to allow the GRE in the future, at least for those that require a test. They'll say you can do the LSAT or the GRE. So we've been working towards being prepared for that period, and it's now arriving. I think that's probably in the middle of the year that'll come out. So if you're preparing this summer, that GRE course is going to be very similar to our new LSAT on demand, the format and structure, or at least the presentation. Obviously, the content will be very different, but that's been pretty cool. We've been working on that for a while, and that'll be coming out as well. And I think that should be pretty competitively priced, which is always nice to hear.
Yeah. And then we're done. And then we'll never make a thing again. We can bet.
Then I'm retired.
Sail into the sunset.
Maybe you are too.
That's right.
Head off to Bali or Hawaii or Bora Bora and just hang out on the beach and drink Mai Tais.
But in the meantime, a lot of cool stuff ahead. It's nice to be able to talk about that with some certainty, given where we are.
Yeah, it really is. So, in total, that really covers 3 parts there. All of the 2022 recap in the LSAT world, then kind of a look forward into 2023 in terms of the LSAT and the admission cycle, and then specifically to what John and I do, which is obviously of high interest to us and hopefully of some interest to others, kind of talking about where we are with all of that. I think that's a pretty good state of the union, John.
I think so too.
Anything to add?
I have one thing to add, and it's just to refill this glass of your excellent wine. Tell your wife again I said thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll go have a lot more of this port. Although you got to watch out with port because the alcohol level in it is really high. It's usually like 19 or 20%, so it can sneak up on you.
My parents are going there in a month, and I've been warning them both. But my mom in particular, like, you're going to like this stuff. Make sure it likes you too. Be careful.
They're heading to Portugal? I didn't realize this.
Yeah, I just helped them plan a trip for next month.
Yeah, I really want to go this year. Maybe I can sneak off over there in April or May.
I'm sure they'll save you a seat.
I'm sure they would. I would love to travel with their parents. I know there'd be a lot of fun.
There'd be a lot of port.
Hopefully on their tab.
Right. Guaranteed.
The way I really like it when someone else is buying the drinks. Well, on that note, I hope everybody has a fantastic 2023. And if you get a chance and you see this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else, please subscribe to it. And if you've enjoyed what we're talking about, leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions for us, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, take care out there, and we'll talk to you soon.